Welcome to Bold Thinking, entrepreneurial stories honestly told. In a world full of chaos, this is a podcast about the people making positive change in the world, using bold thinking to transform businesses and themselves. Jo Dutta is Chief Marketing Officer at Mush, a ready-to-eat startup that's been taking the US by storm. She's earned a global reputation as a transformational marketing leader with creative expertise and a deep business acumen after working across early-stage startups and multinational Fortune 500s in CPG, fashion, retail, and consultancy industries. And I first met Jo probably about 8 years ago when you were working at PepsiCo.
Yeah, that's right.
So welcome to Bold Thinking, Jo.
Thank you so much. What a nice introduction.
And a very impressive career, I have to say. Everyone needs to look Jo up after this. She's had a brilliant career. So tell us a little bit more about that career and how it's led to your relatively new role at Mush.
I'd say I've had a bit of an untraditional background as a marketer. So I actually started off in consulting, in strategic consulting. So definitely more of a kind of left brain start into business, lots of kind of data and analytics, problem solving. And then I worked for John Lewis. So really fell in love with the consumer. John Lewis is all about brand love and customer obsession. So I did a bit of work on the floor, in stores and on the web at the time. And then, as you mentioned, when we met, Julia, I spent the last sort of 8 years at Pepsi, really focused on marketing, brand building, which was amazing, running some brands in the US and in Europe and globally. And then, as you mentioned, I've moved over to the startup world. So working for a challenger brand, we actually make overnight oats or ready-to-eat oats. It's a very small, very fast-moving brand, which is amazing. We're backed by Mark Cuban. We over here, it's called Shark Tank, but we have Dragon's Den. It's a Dragon's Den sort of product. And yeah, it's been amazing. Definitely a huge leap, but a very exciting one.
So, I mean, one of the things we spoke about a couple of weeks ago was this whole transition between corporate world and a startup brand, certainly in terms of people, culture. Has that been quite a big shift for you?
It's been huge. It's been really big. I think it's a huge change, isn't it? When you go from such a big company, I was running sort of very big brands at Pepsi, with really big budgets to coming over and running something very small, very high growth, but with a really small budget. But what I think is really amazing about it, which I didn't really appreciate in a big company, is constraints can really breed creativity. So in a way, it's probably some of the most creative and most interesting work, even if you don't have a big budget. So it's definitely been the most interesting one of the most interesting things I've done.
Well, I've known Jo for many years, and I remember what triggered me to contact Jo and say, can you come on the podcast, was I think it was an Instagram post where you got Kim Kardashian eating a bowl of mush, and I thought, I know Jo is working in a startup, but this feels like this is going big and quick. So tell me a little bit about Mush and the how it's set up, the idea, and what's behind it, and how did Kim Kardashian end up eating it for her breakfast?
Eating porridge for breakfast. Oh, that's so funny, Julia. Yeah, so it's really interesting. The founder of the product, kind of created it. She was kind of put herself through college. She ended up being a trader on Wall Street. She worked for Goldman Sachs. She kind of got there through a lot of grit and determination, and then suddenly realized she sort of hated it, didn't really love it. She was a runner, and she'd been making her own oats to bring to the trading floor because she just needed energy. And like a lot of us, I think, found that she couldn't find anything healthy. Like even at Wall Street, she couldn't find anything convenient and healthy. And then one day just had this idea that it was almost more risky to stay in this big job than it was to kind of quit and go and do what she really wanted, which was to take this product that she thought was really had some legs to it and go and like take it to more people, realizing, eating well can have such a huge impact on like your physical health and your mental health. So she quit her job and got to work and started selling it in farmers markets in San Diego. And then fast forward 5 or 6 years, we're now in all Whole Foods, we're in Target, we're getting into Costco. So it's been really interesting. It's hard to describe on a podcast. I'm going to show Julia, but it's like little pots of overnight soaked oats. They're completely clean. They're plant-based, they're vegan, no sugar added, gluten-free, all of the things, but they're just super convenient. You can kind of eat them on the go. And it's very much grounded in a bit of an athletic community. So CrossFit, we have a lot of runners, we have a lot of people who do Peloton. We call them peak performers, but people as sort of pretty active and quite professional. But yeah, it's been a great ride. To your question about Kim Kardashian, that was a bit of an accident and a bit of a hustle, to tell you the truth, because we don't have big budgets to pay anybody. And that's one thing I think I've really learned in a small company or working on a brand like this. Like, your community is actually your brand. You aren't your brand. So it's been very humbling and very interesting just to really realize that and I think we all know this as marketers, but people don't really care about brands. People care about people. And so what that means for us is we have this incredible community of people who just love the product. They really, really like it, and they'll talk about it. So we have sort of micro influencers who will send them product, we'll send them some swag, and they'll talk a bit more about how they use it for running or athletics or just having a busy day. And then we do have a few people that we every now and again will pay a bit of money, and they'll talk a bit more about the benefits. And then honestly, Kim Kardashian, we found somebody who knew her, who sent some product to her, and she's a vegan, and just liked the product and talked a bit about it. So it was a bit of a fluke and a bit of a bit of a perfect storm, but definitely wasn't grounded in paying her anything.
It's a brilliant story. So one of the things when we started this podcast was really about a lot about optimism, and in this sort of whole pandemic, and there was a lot of concern about where we were going to be in the future. And one of the things we really wanted to focus on is what bold thinking meant, and actually in times of trouble, actually thinking bold. And one of the last people we just spoke to, Carl, who is a retail analyst and reports into CNN, and I was like, what's the worst thing can happen? He went, well, literally companies going bankrupt. That is the sharp end of this sort of stick in this culture. So what does bold thinking mean to you, Joe? And how does that work with you?
I love this question. I've been listening to everybody's answers on your podcast. It's so fascinating. I thought quite hard about this. And I think for me, bold thinking is a bit more about like the how. Like, how do you get your team to be bold? For me, it's about how do you enable we have 17 people and a dog. How do you get the whole team to think boldly? And for me, there's three things. One, I call it, well, the team calls it #unscared, but for me, that I would call it psychological safety. How do you make sure that everybody is able to really feel comfortable when they screw up, honestly? And so we talk about #unscared. We have a weekly meeting on a Friday afternoon, and we sort of thank each other for things that have gone right. But if things have gone wrong, we are fully open to tell people about it and then what we've done about it. I think the second is thinking about failure. It's very similar, but thinking about failure as data acquisition. So again, just encouraging the team, things screw up. They're always going to screw up. You're going to fail forward so much in a startup. We recently, just as a funny anecdote, I got a call from the ops team saying we put too much coffee in we have like a coffee mush oats. We've got 5 times the amount of coffee in it. And the team were like, brilliant, we can market that. We can go start like buzzed up oats to people. So I think it's always like, see failure as data acquisition, and then see opportunity in things when you screw up. And then the last one that I think is so interesting about bold thinking, which was really humbling for me, is like unlearning. And again, in the team, we talk about the beginner's mindset quite a lot, like first principles thinking. So in a startup, it's really easy for you to come in and just say, hey, I did this in a big company. Let's just replicate it. And that's an incredible way to utterly screw up your company and lose a lot of money and potentially get fired, which I almost did in my first few weeks. But I think it's this idea that it's actually a Zen Buddhist principle called Shoshin. And it's this idea that in a beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in an expert's, there are none. And I've definitely seen that in a startup. It's this idea that if you've done something, many times over, you might come into a small company and try and replicate it. And I almost, the analog I think about is like people trying to run into a wall. You just see people run and run and run at it. And what you really need is the person who steps back and figures out how can you actually walk around the wall? What is the way around it? So I think, again, having a kind of beginner's mindset is a really big way to having bold thinking, because that's how you're really going to disrupt and think about something differently. So I think it's that. I think it's psychological safety. it's like being really comfortable with failing, and then just seeing things like from first principles.
No, I love that. And I think that whole sort of like beginner's mindset. I remember reading a book by Douglas Adams, and they always said, how do you come up with some new ideas and some new way of thinking about things? And he said, just ask a 5 or 6 year old, because they're absolutely like not tainted. Not tainted by anything, and it's a world of possibilities sort of enters into everything. So I love that sort of entrepreneurial, bold thinking. So what do you think, Jo, has been your boldest idea, and how did you make it happen?
I think probably leaving a really big, a big corporate America, big budget, big team, and then joining, like I mentioned, a team of 17 people, half of whom are under 25. To join a startup. I think that was probably one of the boldest things I've done. But I actually think the more I think about it, it probably was the least risky thing I've done, because I actually think staying sometimes at big companies or staying in place can be a bit riskier than making a bold move. But I do think that probably is one of the boldest things I feel like I've done. We have a mantra where we actually put it underneath the cups. It's called like start, even if you don't know how. And I think sometimes that's what it feels like to be bold. You kind of go ahead and you do something, even if you don't know what the hell you're doing. So for me, that sometimes is what being bold feels like.
No, I love it. And I think when we spoke on the phone, you talked about the volunteers at the Chicago Institute of Fashion.
Yeah, I do. I do some volunteering. I love fashion. I've done a little bit of work in it in the past as a kind of fractional CMO, and I work with these incredible designers. They almost have that kind of 6-year-old mindset, or have that beginner's mindset. And they're so creative. They're creating just incredible things like clotheslines and just beautiful, like repurposed clothing or sustainable clothing or shoes. And it's so refreshing, I think, sometimes to like really step out of your day to day. I mean, I work in the world of oats. It's it's super cool, but it has its limits. So I think it's really nice sometimes to just be able to like completely step out of that and do something different. And it is a little bit more glamorous, I have to say. But there's something about being with true entrepreneurs, which is really invigorating.
So do you think you'd ever set up your own business?
I don't know. I thought about this on the call before the call. I think for the right idea, I would do it. I think the founder of Mush is a phenomenal woman. She has such grit and determination and hustle that I think, anyone like you, Julia, anyone who set up a company has that incredible drive. And I think you need to really be doing it for something that's so passionate for you. So I think for the right reason, I would. But startups are phenomenal, but they are the hardest thing you will ever do. They'll be the most rewarding thing, but the hardest thing. So I think I'd have to really think about what I was doing it for. But I'd like to think I would start up my own company at some point.
I remember I spoke to someone that set up their own business, and they were saying, the thing is, every day when I wake up, I'm so excited. It doesn't feel like work. So I suppose it's like that definition of what hard is. Because I think people always say to me, it's really, really hard to set up a business. And I'm surrounded by entrepreneurs, and I've met a lot of entrepreneurs, worked a lot of entrepreneurial brands, but it's sort of like they just live it, Yeah. And actually, I think sometimes you can be a little bit scared of being an entrepreneur, but actually it just becomes part of your psyche, isn't it?
I think it starts to rub off. And I think the thing, people keep on asking me, like, should I leave my big job and my title and my driver and whatever in a big company? And I'm like, you've got to know that. You've got to know that you're going to take the garbage out, or you're going to take the rubbish out on a Friday afternoon. Like you're going to, we call it sort of, it's like, I always think about you're scaling a mountain. You could take a helicopter and get to, actually you can't in startup. You can't take a helicopter to get to the summit. You have to just scale that mountain every single day. So that's the hard. But I think the rewarding is you see the fruits of your labor. And like you said, that's the thing that gets you up every morning. You're like, I know that was our work, right? I know we doubled growth last month because we all work really hard. So I think I agree with you. It's exhilarating. It's just very tiring sometimes.
Remember when I set up my second business, I said to my husband, I said, I really don't know. I've got to go back and raise an invoice. How do we do that? And he said, you basically go on a computer, you type one out, you send it off, and then you put it in a filing box. That's just like,
so much of that. It's so much of that. I was, I think I mentioned this at the beginning before we were recording, but in my first week at Mersh, we had this board, somebody had been doing a brainstorm of all the things we needed to do. And I went up close and like, I found a Post-it note on the wall and it just said, figure it the F out. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty much every day at a startup. So that's pretty much a mantra for the team. But you figure out how to do the invoice. You figure out things you've never done before.
I love that. What do you think people want or need from brands today? We spoke a lot about it's building a community as much as building a brand. But, what do you think people want and need from a brand today?
They need community. Like we said, people don't believe in brands. They believe in people. There's also this idea of mimetic behavior. I don't know if that rings a bell. There's this like dreadful book that I don't recommend you read about mimetic behavior, but it basically is this idea that people don't know what to desire. So they have to look at other people to see what they desire, which is kind of scary. But there's this idea that actually Kim Kardashian is going to be the one to tell you what you want. So, but I think this notion of community is so powerful. And then this notion of like, I call it kind of emotional loyalty, which is a bit different to transactional loyalty, which is the difference between, as a consumer, I want to get the shout out on my Peloton. I don't necessarily want a bunch of Marriott rewards. So I think brands have just got to really get the community they're serving, understand what they're passionate about, and then help to fuel that. And then no, this isn't an original thought at all, but just the idea that your mission and you're driven by a mission and trying to do something bigger than just sell a product. And we definitely see that, right? We're really embedded with a CrossFit community. I'm going to spend the weekend handing out merch to people at the Chicago Marathon. I think if you can really tap into what it is you're helping somebody to do, whether that's Peloton really helping people to get fit, if it's Merch, which is really helping people to unleash their potential, Glossier helping people to feel, more natural beauty. I think that's just what's so important right now.
I think it's massive. I've got like a bit of a side question to ask you. What happens if PepsiCo came in and bought you?
It'd be quite funny. Being on both sides. I mean, I think it would be interesting. I think it would be really interesting, and I do think there could be huge opportunity. I think that's where the opportunity lies. We're such a small kind of cult-like brand, but we don't have the ability to distribute, and we do want to get in everybody's hands. We don't want to be a very small kind of like expensive product. We want to be available to everybody so everybody can have a great breakfast. So I think there's quite a lot of value to, if a big company did want to have a look at us, I think we'd be quite well positioned. But I think the trick with everything is to make sure you don't lose the integrity of the brand and the purpose and the love of the brand with scale.
No, it's interesting.
That's a great question.
No, I know. I'm sorry I threw that into Jo. That wasn't on the list, but I had to do it. I had to sneak it in because it's got my mind thinking, because we actually interviewed a big brand a few weeks ago for something not podcast related. And they were working out whether to buy a really big company, relatively big company, but a startup, if you like, compared to them, or they were going to do it themselves. And I said, but why didn't you do it themselves? And they went, being an entrepreneur and setting up that business from scratch and building that momentum, and it's been a lot easier just to have gone in and bought them, because you need that passion, that possibility, that beginner's mindset to really get it going and get the wing beneath the sails. And then we were just happy to sweep in when there were 61 stores and not have to do that sort of like that groundwork. So it just sort of stuck in my head. I thought when I speak to Jo, I'm going to have to say to her.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I remember literally having that conversation at Pepsi, and that's incubating small brands. But you're right, the models are set up so differently. But I do think at the core of it, the mindset is so different. So the opportunity cost of somebody going and spending 2 days handing out products at the marathon, it just isn't in the mindset of a big company. But for me, I'm going because I love the community, but I'm also doing research. I'm figuring out how to position the brand. I'm figuring out how we talk about it. This for me is like the equivalent of $500,000 in consumer research just by standing out handing products at a marathon.
One of the guys we had on a podcast who used to work at Waitrose, before that he used to work at Sainsbury's as a buyer, and one of the 3 guys from Innocence came in to see him in their early days. And they said, we just come to see you. So we're on your radar, but we're not interested in buying you. We just want everybody to know we're here in the world. And they were just so like, he said they were in their 20s and they'd just been down to Glastonbury and said, shall we give up our jobs or not? And he just said, just hats off to them. He said, they just said, we're going to come and meet you as a buyer at Sainsbury's. Just so that when they were good to go, they were good to go.
Yeah, it's amazing. That is amazing. Yeah, Innocent, the story is incredible.
So how optimistic are you at the moment? Obviously, we've been through this global pandemic and some places in the world are fully open, like the UK, I'm grateful to say, but there's still parts of the world which is still very much part of this. And how optimistic are you at the moment?
Yeah, I guess I feel optimistic and also feel a bit responsible, if that makes sense. I feel like we have a role to help, to support, to just, I guess, kind of step back and be aware of all the unintended consequences. I think, there's obviously been the pandemic, but then there's going to be, I think, quite a big knock-on effect from the pandemic. So I think that's something that I'm really conscious of. We've been doing a bit of work talking about kind of mental health and how physical and mental health are so well connected. So I think, yes, I'm very optimistic as a brand. I think particularly where we are, we're just seeing growth. We're so focused, which is nice because we're kind of distracted from a lot of what's happening. But I think we also want to be really aware of the huge impacts that and so much that people are going through.
We were talking earlier with our last guest about he works a lot of big brands, and last year they just had to keep working through it. A lot of businesses were really sort of like having to pivot incredibly quickly. So this year there was a bit of a feeling of fatigue and people having to take 2 or 3 weeks off just to sort of like come back to the table refreshed within that culture.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. And I feel really privileged in a way because I don't think we've had the fatigue in the team, partly because we kind of just kept going. We're so focused. We were also sort of in person, getting tested, but we've also been working very closely together. I think just we've had so much going on that we have been a little bit kind of immune to it. But I definitely have a lot of friends who I think have got a level of burnout, right? It's very real. If you've spent the last 18 months on Zoom calls all day, every day, we've been a little bit kind of in it and running around and slinging oats. So we've been a little bit distracted from it. But yeah, I do think it's very true. And this huge shift of people really considering what they want to do and looking for more purpose, I think has been really interesting as well. Especially in the war for talent. It's been super interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember a friend of mine is really senior in one of the top 4 consultancies. And obviously with this sort of 40% global workforce looking at leaving, they were incredibly worried about retention of people. Is that a big focus, that mush, the retention of people and culture?
Yeah, I think it is. I think some of the tenets I talked about of the culture, I think making sure that continues. We don't lose that as we grow because we're scaling the team as big as the business. And so making sure we still keep what's so kind of unique about the culture, I think is really, really important. I think it's such a purpose-driven business. We really, want to bring healthier foods to everybody, to help people to kind of to be, think and feel and do better. And I think people are really kind of behind that, really behind the product, really behind the kind of the mission of the brand. So I think that is really, really important. And I think that really, that attracts a certain kind of person. And I think also just startups in general do attract a certain kind of person because you're doing it for a very different reason, I think. So I do think it's interesting. I think it's also interesting looking at the people looking to move out of big companies and trying to understand if they're kind of running from something or running to something. And I think, if you have, I think there's a time you need, that 40% of people need to kind of step back and like just take a beat before they figure out what they want to do next. Because burnout is real and you have to like take some time to recover from it before you go to the next thing. But yeah, it's a phenomenal time, I think.
So with brands thriving, for a brand to thrive in the future, what advice would you give from your vast experience in the CMO world?
I think my advice to marketers, like I get often asked, you come from something really big budgets, and you've gone to something really small, and what have you learned? And I do think the first one is your community is your brand. So figure out who your community is and just get really, really close with them and let them tell the story of your brand. You're there to kind of facilitate that as much as you can, to find your brand lovers, to talk to them, to have them tell your story. I think the second one that I've really learned is this idea of you've got to test before you invest. So again, I think of big brands, you go really, really big, really quickly, whether that's innovation or it's your kind of big 30-second TV campaign or it's your packaging, you kind of do it all really, really in a big way. And in a startup, we talk quite a bit about this idea of like, if you're a chef or if you're baking a cake, you would never start with a wedding cake. You'd start with a little cupcake or many cupcakes, and you'd make a kind of birthday cake, and then you go on and make a big wedding cake. So that's how we think about everything, essentially. So, whether that be, like I mentioned, going to the marathon, figuring out your positioning and your how you're going to talk to people, and then kind of testing it through digital ads, and then maybe creating a campaign, like starting very small and building up. I think that's incredibly important. And something that I think is so relevant for a big company, and I wish I'd kind of known that was available, or even silly things like for our we just did a big packaging redesign, and it was basically myself and a 22-year-old graphic designer going to FedEx, sticking things onto a cup and running over to Whole Foods and putting it on the shelf and seeing if it worked. So I think getting really close to your consumer is really important. And then I think the other thing is for brands is just really standing out. Like, I think it's so important to be so distinct. And you talk about that so much as a brand marketer. You talk about salience and brand distinction. But just, I think with so much noise, with so much happening, like as much as your brand can stand out and be distinctive, whether that's visually, verbally, I think is so important.
And it is quite difficult, isn't it? Because sometimes you can be a brand within a brand, like, I don't know, a brand on Amazon or eBay, and then, you sort of lose that voice a little bit, can't you?
Right, exactly. But as much as you can really push for it, I'm a huge believer in Byron Sharp, How Brands Grow, and he talks about linking mental and physical availability, and this idea that your mental availability and kind of brand links has to be so, so strong. And I when you're a small brand, it's so evident because you have to shout because you're so tiny. But I think even for big brands, just continuing to make sure you really, really do stand out and you're really distinct. Even if you are on Amazon, I think it's so important.
I love that. I just want to say thank you today, Joe, for joining us. And thank you everyone for listening to Bold Thinking, Entrepreneurial Stories Honestly Told. And Joe certainly told a very entrepreneurial story about Mush today. If this episode has got you thinking, share your comments on LinkedIn, Twitter or Instagram, or you can contact us at hello@thehonestbrand.com. Join me next time to hear from someone else who's making a positive change in the world. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much.